Greetings, everyone, and welcome to Ion Africa. My name is Awasar. I'm Assistant Director for Academic Affairs at the African Studies Center here at MSU. And Ion Africa is our bi-weekly seminary series. So it used to be weekly, now it's a bi-weekly. And we're very delighted today to have Dr. Andrew Marshall as our guest speaker. So before I pass it over to her, a brief introduction. So Dr. Marshall joined Baylor University's Department of Political Science in fall 2024 as a lecturer after 3 years as a junior research fellow in politics at the University of Oxford's New College. His PhD dissertation, Language Policy and the Nation in East Africa, and postdoctoral and ongoing research examine how state language policies, laws, and rules governing the use of various languages in schools, legislative debates, broadcast media, etc., reflect and shape how people identify with their ethnicity and nation within ethnically and linguistically diverse society through comparative case studies of Kenya and Tanzania. Dr. Marshall has experience teaching comparative government, African politics, political sociology, literature and politics, and international relations. He is also the Assistant Director for the Baylor in Washington program. Thank you so much, Dr. Marshall, for accepting our invitation. And the talk is titled First Languages and the National Language in Politics Along the Kenya-Tanzania Border. Thank you. I pass it over to you.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Saar. I'm very happy to be here virtually with the Ion Africa seminar here through the Michigan State University of African Studies Center. As Awa said, I'm joining you all from Waco here at Baylor University. I'm a lecturer in our Department of Political Science here, and I'm very much looking forward to sharing some of my research about the politics of languages and nationalism in Kenya and Tanzania, in particular. Although I will situate it within my larger research agenda, as we go along through the talk, I will get to at least some preliminary results from a multilingual survey experiment that I fielded with my research partners on the Kenya-Tanzania border, that at least I think helps shed some light on the dimensions of language use in different political contexts between the two, and perhaps says something about the role of state language policy in shaping the options open to politicians, but also the way that ordinary citizens and voters perceive the use of different languages in their political situations. And so what I would like to do for my part of the seminar today is to talk a bit about my overall research agenda, as Dr. Saar introduced, just to go through some of what I've done and what really motivated this survey experiment, talking about generally the comparison of language policies in Kenya and Tanzania, how it relates to understandings of nationalism. Then I'll talk a little bit about the specific context in which this survey experiment was carried out. So we carried out this survey in early 2023 along the kind of the western end of the Kenya-Tanzania border in Migori County, Kenya, and Tarime and Rorya districts in Mara region in Tanzania. So we'll talk a bit about some of my observations from ethnographic research there. Then we'll talk about the survey experiment itself, the design, and how we implemented the study. Then I'll present some preliminary data analysis, although as you will note, there's still a lot more to be done on that. And I'll talk a little bit about where at least I see my work going. But I'm very much looking forward to your comments and questions and feedback. And certainly, if you have to drop off the seminar early or have any more detailed feedback you'd like to send me by email, I'm very open to do that. My email is just Andy, ANDY underscore Marshall with two L's at baylor.edu. Uh, and so I start off here on my outline slide with this photo of the founding presidents of Tanzania and Kenya, Julius Nyerere and Jomo Kenyatta, um, both because of their prominence in the political trajectories of their country, um, but also because both of them helped shape their country's founding and continued development in terms of language policy, in terms of the formal rules and also the more informal practices that we see imposed or exercised by the state about which languages can be used in various functions, in education, in, as we'll talk about mostly in today's talk, in politics, right, political campaigning, in terms of speaking in parliaments, in legislatures, in local council meetings, in terms of which languages can be used in broadcast media, on the radio, or now today in in television. Um, Although it's not an issue I've looked at as much, obviously there's still an important issue about language policy in the courts in terms of what language or languages are people allowed to or required to use in the courts, both on the side of witnesses, but also on the side of lawyers and judges issuing their decisions. In a multilingual society, as both Kenya and Tanzania are, there's a lot of these kind of questions. And both Nyerere and Kenyatta played a big role in shaping the initial language policies of their country. Um, but before we do that, I wanted to do at least a little bit talking about the overall motivation of this study. And I know from talking to Dr. Sarr that we probably have a mix of people who might more identify with African studies versus people specifically from a political science background. Um, Something that was interesting to me as I was reflecting on preparing for this talk is that this particular paper on this survey experiment, I've only actually presented in to political science audiences at political science conferences, which is rare for me because almost all of my research presentations have been much more, at least partially presented in African studies contexts, interdisciplinary contexts, especially my more qualitative research. This study is one that I think fits more within the mainstream of the political science discipline. Um, but as a result, because this is more of an African studies audience, I will spend a little bit less time kind of running through the overall motivations for why I think political scientists should pay more attention to language policy, although we'll talk a bit about that. And hopefully we'll get more into the specifics of Kenya and Tanzania earlier. Um, so I've got this quote up here from the late Kenyan novelist Ngugi wa Thiong'o from his book Decolonizing the Mind. And in this book, in which he extensively looks at the effects, or he makes his argument for what he sees as the effects and the influence of writing in different languages, the role of language in colonialism, the role of language in political and social life, and the development of the individual. And what the claim he makes in this quote here is that the choice of language and the use to which language is put is central to a people's definition of themselves in relation to their natural and social environment, indeed in relation to the entire universe. And if we take claims like this seriously as political scientists, that means that things like which languages have designation as official languages or national languages, or even just have designation as a language into which some state proclamations should be translated. These kind of political choices are important, not just for the practical optics, practicalities and optics of who can access state services, but also in terms of the way that ordinary people themselves and the elites feel about their nation, in the way they think about themselves as a people, as a nation. And so, if we are in political science, at least my argument has been for a number of years, that we need to pay more attention to the role of languages and language policy in terms of shaping our understanding of nations and in terms of the symbolic importance for aspects of inclusion and marginalization of different groups and different individuals, as well as for the practical distributional and political implications. Uh, and after a number of years in which there wasn't a lot published in mainstream political science on the politics of language policy, in the last decade, we have seen more of that start to return to the mainstream. And probably the most prominent study in that vein is Leighton Ramachandran's 2016 article, Language Policy and Human Development. And basically, what they attempt to do in that study is come up with a variable that they call average distance from the official language. So they look at what is the official language of a country, and then they look at the first languages of all the population, and using a measure of linguistic distance in terms of language family mapping, they attempt to come up with, they estimate for each country the linguistic distance of the average citizen from the official language policy. And the implication of their study is, or essentially what they conclude, is that the greater that distance, even controlling for many other factors, the lower the educational attainment in the society, lower levels of human development. This maps on to other research showing lower levels of economic growth. And if we look at the map here from their article, again, it will not surprise those of us who focus on African studies that some of the greatest, the states with some of the highest average distance from the official language among their populations are in sub-Saharan Africa. This is both a function of the fact that we see great linguistic diversity across many sub-Saharan African countries. For example, in the two case studies I'll be talking about today, Kenya has approximately 70 indigenous spoken languages according to Ethnologue, and Tanzania has more than 120 spoken indigenous languages according to Ethnologue. But it's also a function of the colonial legacy in these African states, in that as a result of colonial rule, most of them are using as one, or in some cases as their only official language, the language of the former colonizing power, whether that's French or English or Portuguese. And so as a result, since French, English, Portuguese are not in the same language families as the sub-Saharan African states' indigenous first languages spoken by most people as their first language, that gives these states a very high average distance from the official language. And so my own research agenda then tries to go from this big picture focus on, well, what can we say on average across the world about the relationship between language policy and outcomes that we care about, to saying, okay, well, what if we go in detail and look at several countries? And particularly up until this survey experiment, most of my research has been qualitative research. Because as some of you may have been thinking, as I was just talking about this average distance from the official language measure, that is a pretty blunt measure. This is true also for the measure that we often see in political science papers of ethnolinguistic fractionalization, ELF, right? A measure that basically attempts to calculate the likelihood that if we draw any two people from a population, they will be from different ethnic groups which are usually proxied by whether or not they speak the first language. Um, Both of these measures, average distance from the official language, ethnolinguistic fractionalization, allow us to compare something related to the linguistic makeup of a country systematically cross-nationally, but obviously miss so much of the really interesting variation that we can see if we go in depth into the linguistic situation or the sociolinguistic situation in any given country. And then, especially if on top of that, we try to understand what the official state policies are about language use, and then start investigating what the application of those policies actually looks like in practice. And so, in my dissertation on language policy in the nation in East Africa, um, I spent most of 2019 in Kenya and Tanzania carrying out qualitative field research. And then I've been back for a number of shorter trips in 2020, in 2022, in 2023. Well, 2023 was for my postdoctoral research, as was a short trip this past summer. And what I started looking at was some of the different parts of the language policy. So despite this term language policy often being used in the singular, in most countries, there either isn't a singular state document, law, etc., that is the language policy. Or even if there is, it doesn't actually reflect the diversity of laws and regulations and policies that govern the use of different languages in society. And so for my dissertation, I focused on three particular language policies or domains covered by language policy. The first one, which is probably the most controversial and the one with which most of us are probably most familiar, is the language of instruction in education. Um, this is obviously a controversial issue, and certainly not just in Kenya and Tanzania, nor only in African states. Right? Education, especially primary education, is one of the main ways in which the state and society intersect. And in a multilingual society, it is a very contentious, or it can be a very contentious issue as to which language or languages will be used, not just which language or languages will be taught as subjects to learn the language, but also which language or languages will be used to teach mathematics, to teach the natural sciences, to teach civics. These kind of decisions have a lot to do both with, as Ngugi wa Thiong'o was saying, the way people might define themselves. They also have a lot to do with student learning outcomes, both how well students learn. We know that students learn better in their first language, but also students' ability to access higher education or prestigious jobs, which often are going to require some mastery of the former colonial language in many African states, and students' ability, if they graduate from secondary school or from university, to get fellowships to study abroad, to work in other countries, to work with international NGOs or companies within their home country. All of these are important implications that are related to the language of instruction policy. And then I also, because I am, despite your impression maybe by the end of this talk, because I am rooted in political science as opposed to education or linguistics, I also then looked at two policies that are more clearly involved in formal politics. Right? In a multilingual society like Kenya or like Tanzania, what are the rules around the language debates, around the debates in parliament, and then also at the subnational level. In the case of Tanzania, that would be in terms of their district councils. In the case of Kenya, since 2013, then we're talking about the county assemblies, essentially the equivalent of the state legislatures in the US. And in that research, basically what I looked at then was kind of, well, what are the official policies, which I'll talk about coming up on a slide, and then also what did that look like in practice? And so I interviewed a lot of people involved in language policy, especially language teachers, education officers, politicians, some pastors and Bible translators, just other people that I would come across who would be interested in talking about their perspectives, the national officials from the National Swahili Council in Tanzania, people from other relevant government and social organizations to see both what were the actual laws and then how people were responding to them. Initially, when I wanted to start the dissertation, I had ideas for a lot of other domains that I wanted to look at, and those, as may be the case for some of you who are currently grad students or have done graduate study, I had to cut several of what I think are the most interesting aspects of language policy from my dissertation in order to get it done. One of those is what I'll be talking about in a little bit, the language policies for political campaigns, public rallies, right? So it's one thing to say, what are the laws and regulations for the languages which politicians are able to speak in formal legislative debates? It's another thing to say, okay, what are in a multilingual society, what are the limits, if any, on the use of languages in public campaigning? Uh, and as we'll see, that's an issue where Kenya and Tanzania have taken starkly different positions in policy and to a great extent in practice. Also, what about broadcast media language policies? This is another area, as we'll see, that Kenya and Tanzania have taken starkly different positions. Um, I have research ongoing about the role of Tanzania's promotion of the Kiswahili language as a form of soft power around the world. Right? Often studies on language promotion tend to focus on countries such as China promoting Chinese through the Confucius Institutes, or the role of the US and the UK promoting English through institutions like the Peace Corps or the British Council, or certainly Alliance Française for French, or the Goethe Institute for Germany. But I think there's an interesting case to be made for thinking about the role of Tanzania as a weak state that doesn't have the budget for these kind of activities of these larger powers, but the way in which the promotion of Kiswahili has historically and still currently serves as a form of Tanzanian soft power, both within East Africa, across the continent, and throughout the world. I'm interested in the role of Kiswahili as well in building up the East African community. I've been tracking for some time the formal status and use of Kiswahili in the East African community institutions. And then I'm also interested in the politics of Bible translation broadly. One of the things that I won't get a chance to talk about in today's presentation, but I'm always happy to talk more about, are what are the implications of first language Bible translation projects for politics, and how those might be different in countries that have different language policies. Um, so, for instance, one of the two first languages in my survey, Igi Korea, just had its first full Bible translation come out in 2022 or 2023. And I'm very interested both in how access to scriptures in first languages shapes people's religious experience, but also in the political implications of which languages do or do not have scriptures, Bibles, other religious traditions, works in their language or not. So that's a lot of what I work on overall. As we move into talking about this study, then I use a range of, or I have used a range of methods in my research. As I said, most of what I've done so far has been qualitative. So I've done a lot of archival research in the Kenya National Archives, Tanzania National Archives, the East Africana collection at the University of Dar es Salaam, the newspaper collection both at the Nation Center in Kenya and at the Macmillan and the newspaper collection at the Macmillan Library in Nairobi, as well as other research at the British National Archives and various other relevant colonial archives in the UK. I've done a number of semi-structured interviews, as I said, especially with educators, but also with politicians and other stakeholders in language policy. In my time in East Africa, I've done a lot of ethnographic observation. For most of a month, I sat in on the activities of the Migori County Assembly, and especially its Hansard office that's in charge of transcribing the speeches on the floor. I've attended other government meetings and public rallies, and mostly do my best when I'm in East Africa to observe the different ways that language is both officially regulated and in which it is used practically and how that might relate to politics. And then also, now I have this survey experiment fielded again in 2023 and motivated by the idea that, well, we can perhaps see whether there is further support, even within the constraints of what we can do with a survey, for the larger thrust of my qualitative research. So for my comparison, I'm studying Kenya and Tanzania. There are a lot of reasons why I think these two countries broadly are good comparative cases. Right? They both, as I mentioned, they both are very ethnolinguistically diverse. They both were former British colonies, although mainland Tanzania has an earlier history of having been colonized by Germany prior to World War I. And more importantly for this study, at independence, they both had choice of a similar set of languages, right? The use of English as the former colonial language, the use of one or several or multiple of the major first languages, indigenous first languages spoken by many people as their mother tongue, and somewhat different from many other African countries, they also had the choice of Kiswahili as a language that was not widely spread as a first language yet in either country, mostly the first language just of a relatively small and politically marginalized Swahili population along the Indian Ocean coast and in Zanzibar, in the case of Tanzania, but which had already spread widely through both countries, especially Tanzania, or mainland Tanganyika, as mainland Tanzania was known, as a second language, as a language of trade, as a language of interaction with the state. And so you have this option of another language that's not closely identified with a politically dominant ethnicity as a possible vehicle for national unity. Uh, and so, as I said, both countries have a lot of languages spoken. And since independence, what we've seen is that Tanzania is noted for its strong promotion of the Kiswahili language. And it uses, as we'll talk about, Kiswahili is the language of instruction in state primary schools from Standard 1 through Standard 7. Kiswahili is the language that is disproportional. In fact, almost 100% of the debates in the Tanzania National Assembly use Kiswahili. And what we can see if we look at the ethnologue profiles here is that basically Tanzania has one language that ethnologue classifies as institutional. That's Kiswahili. Actually, they probably have two, Kiswahili and English. But we also see a lot of first languages in Tanzania that are endangered because there's not as much space for them to be used in politics, in broadcast media, in primary school. While if we look over to the Kenyan side, Kenya has many more languages that count as institutional to ethnologue because they are allowed to be used in primary education, because we find them in radio and being used for radio stations and television networks, because they can be used in political rallies. And we see many fewer Kenyan languages which are listed as endangered according to ethnologue. And so just briefly then before we jump into the actual focus on the language of campaigns, let's just overview a little bit the policy differences in language policy between Kenya and Tanzania. One thing that I should say to start with, and this, for those of you who study political science or public policy, this is the kind of thing that helps motivate my study, is that if we look only at the top line policies for both countries, we could say Kenya and Tanzania have the same language policy because each country has two official languages, and they are the same two official languages, English and Kiswahili. Each country also has one language which is recognized as having a separate status, the national language, and that language is Kiswahili. And so in that sense, at a high level, Kenya and Tanzania have the same state language policy. Two official languages, English and Kiswahili, only one national language, Kiswahili. But if we look in practice, and if we drill down into these different issue areas, we see significant differences. So in parliament, here again, interestingly, both countries' parliaments actually have the same standing orders on language use, with the exception that Kenya has more space for Kenyan Sign Language. But that policy is simply that a member of parliament may speak in either English or Kiswahili, again, or on the Kenyan side, Kenyan Sign Language. And that speech, other than in KSL, but that speech in English or Kiswahili will not be translated into the other language. And that member of parliament is supposed to continue their speech in the same language they started. So they're not supposed to be mixing English and Kiswahili in any given speech. However, in practice, the Tanzanian parliament basically functions 100% in Kiswahili. In fact, if we exclude the elections of members of the East African Legislative Assembly, I think it's possible, although I haven't fully tracked this down myself yet, that the last full regular order English speech, not by a visiting guest or something, but the last regular order Kiswahili language speech in the Tanzanian parliament probably happened around 1965, as one of the budget speeches around that. If we look on the Kenyan side, as this newspaper headline highlights, the Kenyan National Assembly was all in English from independence in 1963 up until 1974, when Jomo Kenyatta basically forced the National Assembly overnight to start using Kiswahili on July 5th, 1974. That experiment did not go very well. MPs were not prepared. And so in 1979, under Kenyatta's predecessor, the Kenyan parliament, or the Kenyan constitution, was amended to make the parliament officially bilingual. But in practice, over the 80s into the early 90s, the Kenyan National Assembly drifted back towards the use of English. And today, English is much more common than Kiswahili. In the subnational legislative debates, the Tanzanian side, officially all in Kiswahili. On the Kenyan side, officially in Kiswahili or in English, although there are some articles about what would technically be illegal or at least unconstitutional use of other first languages in more ethnically homogeneous county assemblies. In schools, again, Tanzania uses Kiswahili as a language of instruction in most state primary schools from the first 7 years of primary education. And then officially Kiswahili is the language of instruction, or sorry, officially English is the language of instruction of secondary school and higher education, with mandatory Kiswahili as a subject for lower secondary school. On the Kenyan side, officially there is space to use the so-called language of the catchment area, the locally predominant first language, in the first 3-4 years of lower primary school as a language of instruction. But in practice, In many schools, English is used as the predominant language of instruction very early. Kiswahili remains a required subject. And I'm currently doing some research to see whether the new competency-based curriculum in Kenya has led to an expanded role for other indigenous languages in Kenya. Then in broadcast media, we get to a situation where on the Tanzanian side, it is basically illegal to have a commercial television or radio station that uses a language other than English or Kiswahili. There are a few non-commercial, nonprofit radio stations in rural areas which can and have received waivers of that policy um, if they apply for the waiver on a justification that they wish to use another indigenous Tanzanian language other than Kiswahili to reach their community. So, for example, there is a radio station in northern Tanzania, in an area heavily populated by the Maasai people, that has a waiver to broadcast the hourly news in Kiswahili and then broadcast it right after in the Ma language. But that's very rare in Tanzania. In Kenya, when I went to the Kenyan equivalent of the FCC to interview them about this, they basically said they don't keep track of how many languages are in use. When you apply to start a new station in Kenya, in your business plan, you would have to justify what languages you want to use. But there are television networks in probably upwards of a dozen languages or more in Kenya, and radio stations from talking to different people, it seems like broadcasting in at least half of the 70 languages spoken in Kenya. So that is another significant policy choice the two countries have made. Which brings us then to political campaigns. Um, Political campaigns is another area where we see a stark difference between Kenyan policy and practice and Tanzanian policy and practice. So if we go back to 1965, which is the first national election after Tanganyikan or Tanzanian independence, it was the first legislative election after. There was the presidential election in 62. But the first regular legislative election to re-elect or to elect a new parliament since independence, delayed by the merger with Zanzibar and other issues. And in the rules back determining the rules for that policy, they specifically outlaw what the commission called tribal languages and insist that all election meetings should be Swahili. As you can see here in the relevant quote. And that policy more or less remains the official policy in Tanzania today. It doesn't mean that it's 100% enforced. Right? It doesn't mean that you can't find other indigenous languages that are not Kiswahili being used in Tanzanian campaigns, both in accepted ways, such as traditional greetings in the locally predominant first language, maybe cracking a joke, or even in less acceptable ways, such as talking about controversial topics such as female genital mutilation in communities which have traditionally practiced that. But it does mean that on the whole, campaigning for elected office, such as member of parliament in Tanzania, is going to be done in Swahili. That is not the case on the Kenyan side, although, again, Jomo Kenyatta promoted Kiswahili, especially in 1974. He had his seminal work Facing Mount Kenya translated into Kiswahili in the 1960s. It's also the case that for a long time, Kenya has had basically the ability, subject to the sometimes, especially under one-party rule, arbitrary decisions of the state. Kenya has had a policy where you can campaign in any language you wish to campaign. And so that is obviously a very different understanding of the role of language in the nation and in national elections, right? Should candidates be constrained to campaigning everywhere in the national language, or should candidates be free to campaign in the language that they wish to use to speak to people who share the same first language with them? And this is not, in case you're thinking, well, why are we back in 65? This is still a relevant issue. So this is a quote from 2023 from Kenya's then deputy president, who now has been impeached and removed and is one of the leaders of the opposition. But then Deputy President Gachagua at a celebration of a noted gospel singer in his first language, the Gikuyu language, the first language associated with the Kikuyu people of central Kenya. Gachagua said, "I'm a Gikuyu, and there is nothing you can do about it." Right? I was brought up in this region, being fed chewed bananas straight from mother's mouth. If speaking in the Gikuyu language will take away this deputy president seat, so be it. That is the language that we will be using to address our people. And this is not just a position of Gachagua, right? We see this in the case of former President Uhuru Kenyatta, who would routinely address major meetings in central Kenya in Gikuyu, such as major prayer rallies, for example, as well as the late former Prime Minister Raila Odinga, who, when campaigning among his co-ethnics in Nyanza, would frequently use the Luo. Something that, again, would be much basically unheard of in Tanzania for major national politicians, even going to be campaigning among their co-ethnics in the first language as opposed to Kiswahili. And so, as I move into the preliminary analysis of my study, basically, what I chose to do for this survey was look at two areas along the Kenya-Tanzania border where I had done some field research. And that would be Migori County in southwestern Kenya, and just across the border in Mara region, Tanzania, the Tarime and Rorya districts. And these two areas, one, have several ethnic identities that cross the border. So the Luo people, the speakers of the Luo language, are the predominant ethnicity in Migori County. And then also across the border in Rorya district, they are prominent. And then the Abakuria people are the predominant ethnicity in Tarime district and also in the southern sub-counties of Migori County. So this allows us to look at two first languages, which are not Kiswahili, in this area and see the different ways in which they're used. From talking to different politicians and from my own observations, on the Tanzanian side, you see Kiswahili being used heavily. Igikuria might be used for greetings in a rally, maybe for one-on-one campaigning, and also at times, as I said, again, there were anecdotal reports during the 2020 campaign of certain candidates switching, technically against the policy, into Igikuria to launch gendered insults, for example, or defend the illegal use of the illegal tradition of female genital mutilation. But even in Tarime, in an area that's heavily comprised of Igikuria speakers, it's still the case that Kiswahili was almost entirely used. And for example, in this rally in 2019 that I went to, after the ruling party had swept all of the local offices because the opposition boycotted the local elections after many of their candidates were disqualified from running, that rally ran basically entirely in Kiswahili, other than some Igikuria greetings. On the other side of the border, in Kenya, as we might expect with this more open policy, the use of language varied much more. From campaigns by Kuria politicians in the more Kuria areas using Igikuria, to politicians in the Luo-speaking areas using the Luo, but also politicians using Kiswahili in more ethno-linguistically mixed areas, and perhaps, although less so in Migori County, the use of English, um, certainly English phrasing, and depending on the audience, perhaps among audiences that have had more formal education or also more cosmopolitan, you might see some English used as well. And so that's the context in which we see the politics in this area. And so what I was able to do with working with the Georgetown University Initiative for Innovation Development on innovation development and evaluation on the Kenyan side, and the Association for the Termination of Female Genital Mutilation, Masanga, ATFGM Masanga, on the Tanzanian side, was to field a survey experiment. And in this survey experiment, we had teams of enumerators go out and survey on each side of the border, half predominantly the Luo speaking areas, half predominantly Igbo speaking areas. So surveying people who predominantly identified one of these two first languages as their first language, but also knowing Kiswahili. After they answered some demographic questions, then they heard a brief audio message, which they were randomized to hear in either Swahili or in their first language. And as I'll show on the next slide, it's kind of a kind of generic political message adapted from Kenyan President Kibaki's Kenyatta Day speech in 2007 about promoting national development. Then, after hearing their speech in either Kiswahili or their first language, they were listened to 17 statements about the speaker, as we'll see, like, for example, this speaker would be a good member of parliament. And then they indicated their agreement or disagreement with that statement, on a 5-point scale. So they either strongly disagreed, neutral, agree, strongly agree. And then they had two open-ended questions explaining the Likert scale responses. So I won't read the entire speech here, but this is basically the audio which they heard in the survey. And in the speech, I chose it because it doesn't specifically mention a party agenda, right? It doesn't specifically talk about positions on particular projects or the role of Kenya or Tanzania in the world or local issues specific to a given area of people maybe of the same ethnicity. Instead, we have kind of generic promotion of working together, building up the country, maybe slight priming in favor of the nation as opposed to local ethnicities, but generally a speech that people would not identify with a particular political party. And we had that recorded then, translated and recorded into Kiswahili, Igbo, and Dholuo. Then our respondents heard listed their agreement or disagreement with a series of statements like these. The speaker likely understands the challenges facing me and my family. Right? The speaker is well prepared for the responsibilities of national leadership. The speaker is well educated. The speaker's suggestions are good. Right? The speaker would be a good MP, contrasted with the next statement. Right? The speaker would be a good member of the local council in Tanzania or the member of county assembly. And would I consider voting for the speaker? And so in line with this study by Jacob Ricks from 2020, which ran a similar research design in rural Thailand, then developed these three hypotheses. First, we might think that relative to when we hear a candidate using Dholu or Igbo, people who heard the candidate using Kiswahili, that use of Kiswahili might be associated with greater perceptions of greater fitness for political office. If we identify Kiswahili as the national language, the language of national politics, we might expect that the candidate's use of Dholu or Igbo, right, if they hear the treatment in the first language relative to hearing it in Kiswahili, potential voters might feel greater kinship with the potential candidate. And then the third one, right, we might think that in terms of electoral appeal, likelihood that you'd vote for them, that maybe the first language would be a strength for that. both because we see politicians actually doing this in Kenya, and at least back in 1965, the Tanzanian government felt the need to ban the use of so-called tribal languages. So they at least seem to think that there were politicians who would use those languages to their advantage. And so I submitted a pre-analysis plan to the eGAP database now, which I guess now has been retired, but it's still accessible, to try and use factor analysis to group some of the statements together, and then to use difference of means tests to see if we see a systematic difference or not between the control group, that is the group that heard the language in Swahili, and the treatment group, the group that heard the statement in their first language. And there are some further elements that I will need to do in the future going forward. So ultimately, when we ran the survey in 2023, our enumerators contacted about 1,500. Well, they contacted more, but they initiated the survey with about 1,500, 1,540 people. Not everyone met all the demographic eligibility requirements or, after learning about the study, consented to participate. So we ultimately had a sample of 1,436 participants. And as you can see on this chart, we basically were able to get, we oversampled for each group, but we're basically able to get fairly balanced data in terms of in each country, having our samples split between first language Luo speakers and first language Igikuria speakers, and then within each country's first language communities being split, as we should be, between those receiving the first language treatment and those receiving the message in the Kiswahili control. And so in our preliminary analysis, if we look at these are the full list of 17 statements, and we look at the means, that is to say, right, to strongly agree, disagree, what we can see is that, and then we look at the difference between the average responses of those people who received the Kiswahili audio and those people who received the first language audio. We can see that on a number of statements, right, on at least 6 of the statements, we have statistically significant difference of means. And in fact, quite statistically significant difference of means, right? Certainly beyond 95% level. In some cases, well beyond 99.9% statistical significance or confidence levels. And what I would like to do as I go forward with my analysis then is to say, okay, let's start from this baseline, and then I ran the exploratory factor analysis where we loaded these 17 statements roughly into they were roughly placed into 3 different indicator variables, of which we can see there also 2 of the 3 indicator variables are statistically significant, both kinship and fitness for office. And the kinship variable, right, in line with, as we would predict, across the Kenyan and Tanzanian side, we see some more evidence that people are more likely to identify kinship with the speaker when they hear the message in their first language than in the national language. But what's interesting to me, and I think more important, is, right, these tests are just looking at the whole sample, looking at all the data that I've looked at. But if we break it down by the national samples, that's when things get very interesting, because it turns out that most of the statistical significance that we're observing here is being driven on the Kenyan side. That on the Tanzanian side, across most of these statements, there's very little evidence that, or very little difference between those who heard the message in Kiswahili versus those who heard the message in their first language, which is not true on the Kenyan side. In fact, even here, for example, if we look at this statement, I would consider voting for the speaker if he were running for office in the next election. If we look at the statistical analysis of this for the whole sample, We see it is not statistically significant at conventional, the difference in means is not statistically significant at conventional levels. Um, but then if we break it down into the subsamples, we see again on the Tanzanian side, not a statistically significant difference. But on the Kenyan side, we see that we do have a statistically significant difference. And so what this is also pointing to, and it is, if I look at my notes here, I believe it is about a sixth of a standard deviation worth. And so I think we can argue that it's substantively significant as well. And so what this is suggesting is that when we revisit our hypotheses, what we see is that, okay, the first hypothesis was not supported in either country, right? Kiswahili did not seem to be, hearing the treatment in Kiswahili did not seem to be boosting support for candidates, even in Tanzania, where we might expect it would. Across the whole sample, the use of the Luo or Ikikuria relative to Kiswahili did seem to be was associated with a greater sense of kinship in line with those statements. But from the political science perspective, the interesting finding here is that the idea that the Luo or Ikikuria using the first language or hearing the message in the first language is associated with greater electoral appeal appears to only hold true in Kenya, not in Tanzania, right? So while we don't see the Kiswahili message associated with greater electoral appeal either, it appears to mostly wash out on the Tanzanian side. And so to me, this is potentially a very striking finding, because what it shows is that after, if we think about the 1965 change, so after 61 years of a language policy that basically bans the use of languages other than Kiswahili in campaigning for politics, it appears to be the case that even if Tanzania were, or at least the upshot of this study would be that even if Tanzania tomorrow were to adopt Kenya's language campaigning policy, it would not be as beneficial for Tanzanian politicians to start campaigning in the first language in the way that many Kenyan politicians assume it is on their side. And I think this indicates the potential for long-term language policy to drive change in society, right? I'm not claiming that language policy is the only factor driving this, but I think that this is an important application of the importance of language policy, that we can see in this study at least suggestive evidence in line with my qualitative research that the language policy differences between Kenya and Tanzania do matter. And they matter in ways that affect the choices open to politicians. And they matter in ways that have also affected and reflected changes ongoing in Kenyan and Tanzanian society, such that, as I said, even now, after generations of this language policy, changing the policy itself might not change things, or at least not for some time, because people's expectations around the meaning of languages in politics have fundamentally changed. So, as I wrap up here, where am I going further with this? So I'm going to continue my subsample analysis, especially looking at whether we see differences between the first language subsamples, between the Luo speakers and Igikuria samples, within each nationality on the Kenyan and Tanzanian sides. Thanks to support from Baylor University, Georgetown's Guide Institute initiative has just finished translating and transcribing the two open-ended responses for my questions, in which respondents explain why they chose the Likert scale responses they chose. So looking into those should give me a greater sense of what's going on as well. And then I certainly am always considering new ideas for future studies. So there's lots more I could talk about. I've already talked more than I was planning to, but I'd also like to thank you all for listening and to thank my assorted funders and research partners. And I look forward to any and all questions and comments that you may have for me. And as I said, if you have to duck off early or if you have more detailed comments, I would welcome those by email as well. So thank you very much, and I look forward to continuing to engage with you for the rest of our seminar today.
Thank you very, very, very much, Dr. Marshall. That was a very informative presentation as somebody from Senegal with no language policy, people using everything and anything. That was eye-opening to hear about the different policies in different countries in East Africa. So now it's time for questions. So you can type your questions or you can raise your hands, whichever way works best for you to ask your questions or make your comments. And I think you already have questions in the Q&A. You can read them, choose. It's up to you, however you want to go ahead to answer those questions. And I will look at the list of attendees. If anybody raise their hands, I can allow them to speak, but you can
Maybe
answer the
if I just
question.
talk a little bit, look at these questions we've got in the chat here, which are
Yes.
all great questions here. I see we've got Solomon's question here about a country's language policy can pose challenges in terms of educational quality, equity, social cohesion, the level of institutional support that is readily available to populations whose mother language has historically been different from the lingua franca. What strategies can help adjust these challenges to help create a more just, equitable, and cohesive society in sub-Saharan Africa? This is a very important question. And I think one of the things, I think when I started this research, the way the comparison is often talked about between Kenya and Tanzania, and in the past, I think not so much anymore, is that Tanzania is this paragon of indigenous language policy, or pro-indigenous language policy because of its support for Kiswahili, whereas Kenya has not supported Kiswahili in the same way, but has all this support for English. And that is an important aspect of the two countries' policies. But it's also the case that Kenya has put more, not to the same extent as English, but has had more space for the use of the indigenous languages in terms of, let's say, broadcast media, in terms of political campaigns, and also, if we're looking at institutional support, there has been more space, although not as formally promoted as English and Kiswahili, for the use of indigenous languages in lower primary education. And that, as I said, I'm looking into in the ongoing rollout of the competency-based curriculum in Kenya. One of the things I'm really interested in is whether that kind of curriculum is something, to Solomon's question, that is actually helping to promote more space for indigenous languages. I know those of you who follow Kenyan education probably know for the first time in modern Kenyan history, indigenous languages, as in languages that are not Kiswahili or English, is now in both a subject in lower primary, or it can even be the language of instruction in lower primary. That's been the case for a while, and it's not really being implemented much. But there is now space for an indigenous languages subject in upper primary, and even an indigenous languages elective in secondary school. And so I think when looking at the Kenya and Tanzanian comparison, it's not so much, right, I'm not endorsing one or the other set of policies as the ideal way to promote indigenous languages or not, but I think in the tension between the two of them, we can see a range of different options. And I'm certainly interested in continuing to look further into their implications and what alternatives there are. Let's see then quickly here. I see Bahati has said the contribution of this study to the two countries' language policies. This is something I'm definitely still working on. I'm hoping to build out my dissertation into a book that would also include this study. And I think part of what I see myself as doing is engaging with a host of stakeholders in Kenya and Tanzania to get a better sense of elite and public views on these policies, and to show that there are alternatives. All right, I'm not proposing an idealized policy for either country, but I think both from within the public policy establishments of each country, among the general population, and among social scientists outside of Kenya and Tanzania, I think a better understanding of the nuances of the two countries' language policies can both help improve our understanding of both societies and open up more space, perhaps for a more wide-ranging dialogue about these policies. Um, let's see, to Zachary's question, yes, I have thought about religious services. I haven't collected data on this, um, but this is a very interesting one. In fact, I have a side project thinking about how in the 60s and 70s the mainstream denominations in Tanzania significantly increased the use of Kiswahili in their services. Depending on the account, due to desire to align with the socialist promotion of Kiswahili under Ujamaa Tanzania, or according to other accounts, including some oral histories from the Maryknoll Fathers, because of direct or indirect coercion from the Tanzanian state. And so I think the role of different languages in different services across denominations and across countries, especially in a place like the border area of Migori and Tarime, um, is absolutely um, is absolutely something I would like to look at going forward, where you can see, I said, if there's an Igi Korea Bible now out, is it used differently on the Kenyan and Tanzanian border? This is something I'm very interested in. Um, and then the last question here in the chat, and I know we've got some hands up as well. I see Jennifer Olson says, thank you for an interesting study. I'm wondering about potential changes in Tanzania's language policy related to education. Do you think the policy might change? What are the pros and cons? This was a large focus of my dissertation, um, both because those of you who follow Tanzanian historical educational development know that in the early 1980s there was a major commission that came out with a report that called for the gradual continuation of Kiswahili as the language of instruction beyond primary school into secondary school by, I think, the late 80s, and then by the early 90s, planned to have Kiswahili as the language of instruction at the university level as well. And the ruling party and Julius Nyerere, the president, still the president at that time, famously rejected that part of the report. And this is where, although it turns out Nyerere had also said this earlier, this is where Nyerere famously said that English is the Kiswahili of the world, in rejecting going all in on Kiswahili as the language of instruction from primary up to higher education. And what we have seen since then is English has gained some further footholds in the Tanzanian education system. After in the early 1990s, after the end of Ujamaa socialism, we saw the only subject other than language taught in Kiswahili at the secondary level, siasa, which is essentially politics, turned into the subject civics taught in English now. So there are no other subjects officially taught in Kiswahili at the secondary level in Tanzania. And increasingly, and this is even really since my research in 2019, we've seen an increase in the number of new state primary schools using English as a language of instruction. There's still a significant minority of the schools, but we are seeing for the first time a number of state primary schools that are officially using English as a language of instruction, like the private schools. And I think this is a challenge. This is a challenge to the dominance of Kiswahili in primary school, and does reopen this question. There are obviously pros and cons to make the whole system Kiswahili or to make the whole system English. But by going in for neither, the Tanzanian system is at this point where students come out of primary school, of state primary school, having been taught in Kiswahili, and then go into secondary school where they're expected to be ready to handle all subjects in English. And I think historically, and still to this day, that switch is very challenging for many students, and um, I think is a real challenge for the outcomes of the Tanzanian educational system. And I think is that
Can we,
um, yep.
can we let Bruce ask their questions before we go back to the Q&A? So I allowed them to speak. Can you
Yes.
go ahead, Bruce? Bruce? Okay. Let's go to Bahati.
Thank you. I'm Bahati Kayaga, a UMAP scholar. I'm so happy to this start today, listen about Tanzania and Kenya, and I'm from Tanzania, and I love to speak Kiswahili, so I'm so proud of for this study that has been done there. And my question was to ask on the choice of choosing the Tarime that is in Tanzania and Migori in Kenya, because also you said the common ground of using Tanzania and Kenya because we are sharing like the English, also we have the Swahili, but I just wish to see why did you choose that side of Tarime, and we have another side where we connect with Kenya, and that is the other part of beside the Tarime, we have the Talangile. Also, it is a border to Kenya. I would also want to know why did you decided to go in that side. But also, I would like to comment on the part of the parliament on the use of or the use of Swahili and English. And commonly, most of the people in our society, they tend to complain the way, sorry, not the parliament, the court, the way the court, they tend to document the issue of the case that are being the people who are going to court to get their right. When you come to the issue of the document are being written in English, and while the court is just handled in Kiswahili. So that is also a challenge to our society, and people, they just wish everything to be written in Swahili because most of the society or most of the community, sometimes they are so proud with the Swahili language, as you explained, that we are commonly use Swahili in different issues. So my question was on the how do we how do this can this through this study that has been done can lead to the contribution on how these people can be supported so that they can just go to court if the document are being written by using the English language. That was only for this time. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for those questions, Bahati. To your first one, um, the reason I chose so my dissertation research, basically I split my time in 2019 half and half between Kenya and Tanzania, and then in each country, I'd wanted to be in a major cosmopolitan multilingual urban area. So I was primarily in Dar es Salaam and then in Nairobi, and then on either side of the border. On the Tanzanian side, I was also in Dodoma, a bit for to interact with politicians and state offices there. And I didn't know much about Migori and Tarime before I started my research there, but I have been talking to some of my professors at Georgetown. Initially, I had thought about going on the eastern side of the Kenya-Tanzania border, right, kind of south of Mombasa and north of Tanga. Um, Partially because I was very interested in the relationship between Kiswahili and some of the Bantu languages there, say of the Mijikenda and other groups. But ultimately, I got the recommendation, which I think makes sense, to actually go to an area where Kiswahili would be less of a strong language, especially among the Luo community. Um, and so that was really why I went there. I didn't do a systematic examination of all the options along the border, but certainly going forward, one of the things is right, as I put on I think my last slide, this survey experiment was just in this one particular context, and I think it's an open question as to would we find. I think you would find similar findings in other parts of the border, or even some interior parts of Kenya and Tanzania. But I don't know that. And I think local context is very important. So I had a chance to again, spend some time in Tarime and Migori. But in the future, I certainly would be open to other parts. And then your point is very well taken about this issue about documents, especially on the Tanzanian side. It's an issue to some extent on the Kenyan side as well. But on the Tanzanian side, where you've had for a long time MPs debating in Kiswahili about laws for which the authoritative version is in English, and as I said, legal language policy and court language policy has not been one of the issue areas I've focused on. But I have heard this issue as well, especially at the higher courts in Tanzania, where you have proceedings going. Perhaps in Kiswahili, but you're still getting judgments in English. My understanding is that President Magufuli was moving, especially early in his second term, to push for the further Swahilization of the writing of laws, and especially the back translating of the existing legal canon in Tanzania into legally authoritative Kiswahili. Um, but I have not really followed up on the status of that project. Since I do know that on the issue of current laws in Tanzanian Parliament, my understanding is that they are continuing to move to a much more Kiswahili document-based space than they have been, but that this has been a challenge even in Tanzania, heralded for their Kiswahili use, to still have kind of the documentary underpinnings of their legal system running on English, has been a real challenge that has, as you point out, prevented some fuller participation in the legal and political system that the official use of Kiswahili otherwise would allow.
I think there is one comment in the Q&A and one question in the chat from Leo Zulu.
Yes. Okay. Yes, I see here. And also I will point out for anyone, I know some people were asking, and I see Dr. Sar did the same. But I have put my email into the chat. But yes, I see Leo Zulu has said we sometimes ignore the impact of language policies and what opportunities particular languages might have. There are general concerns about the loss of some less commonly taught languages, as major colonial languages are seen as languages for upward mobility, both among young people and their parents. Do you have any insights of relative success and future prospects in this effort in your study? Yeah, this is a very good point, and this is one of the reasons why I think kind of qualitative and ethnographic politics research can play an important role in discussing these issues, because if you just start from a place of kind of political theory about what the good or the just or the inclusive language policy should be, I think you, especially in Kenya and Tanzania, you get to a place where people are not holding the positions that you might expect them to hold. And so in a lot of my own conversations, right, many people who are concerned about the idea of, for example, continuing this or undoing this decision of the early 80s to make secondary school use Swahili as language of instruction. Many of the people who are strongly opposed to that are students and parents in state secondary schools because they are very concerned that if the state secondary schools get turned to use Kiswahili as language of instruction, then we will see the elites who will still be in their private secondary schools, then using English, just like they do for the private primary schools, have completely locked out much of the population from those upper end educational and professional opportunities. And on the Kenyan side as well, again, when I was talking to people about what would, especially even teachers, curriculum developers, other people I met, what do you know about this new indigenous languages subject? Should we expect that it's going to, will many students take it? Will people be promoting it? And what a lot of people said is, well, first, is it going to be examined in the national examinations? Right? This is something we're now getting to as we've gone through the CBC up now to the junior secondary school. Certainly, if it's not going to have a national exam that's going to be equally weighted so that it could contribute to your national exam scores, then it's not going to be something that people are going to take up. And even if it is, precisely to Leo's points here, the question is, well, what are there going to be jobs for people who take indigenous languages instead of doubling down on English or taking more science or something like that? And I think one of the things I'm interested, this is maybe not directly answering Leo's question, but one of the things I'm interested in as we look at the rollout of the CBC around Kenya is I have seen a number of media stories highlighting some counties and some linguistic communities that do seem to be taking advantage of that policy space in the CBC to develop some more educational materials for their first language. And I know that East African educational publishers early in the CBC rollout came up with a set of textbooks that were approved by the Kenyan Institute for Curriculum Development of a 3-year sequence of books in 4 or 5, maybe 6 different indigenous languages other than Kiswahili. I have book 1 for the Luo, but the uptake of that has not been very high. And so I guess I will be continuing to look, especially on the Kenyan side, to see, do we see variation in this more open political environment on the Kenyan side, variation in how first language education is taken up or not, and in what kinds of communities do we see more support for it? I've also been, although I haven't seen a lot of evidence for this, one Kenyan aspect I'm interested in is the early child development education, which is right, essentially the pre-primary education, which is under the Kenyan constitution devolved to the county governments. And so, as a political scientist, right, I could imagine that promoting early childhood education with indigenous languages, where it's often used, could be a way for politicians to signal kinship. Right? I've seen politicians have rallies dedicating ECDE classrooms because that's something the county government can do in local wards. But I've not yet seen a lot on the language side. But that's something that I'm interested in tracking. And then Mwalimu Ngonyani, I see. Thank you very much for your comments. You raise a very good point, which is absolutely true especially on the Tanzanian side, about the fact that mainland Tanzania is run like a unitary state, and you have since Nyerere and early times this policy of rotating even mid-level state bureaucrats around the whole country, right? Functionally means that on the executive side, Kiswahili is the language of the offices, and so this is a factor, and this is one of the reasons why I had the question in the survey of looking at fitness for local councils versus on the Kenyan side, county assembly, because of concerns about, well, maybe it's just the case on the Tanzanian side that someone who campaigns in a first language for a local councilor role, if they get elected to the district council, and then they're only going to be able to use Swahili because all of the executive officers for the council and for the district are rotated in from other regions and other ethnolinguistic groups. That is perhaps a different situation than we are seeing in the county assemblies in Kenya.
I think we can take one more question. It's in the chat from Janet.
Oh, yes, I see Janet has written here, to what extent does language policy play the othering role? About soft power, what is your take on the emerging language policy conversation regarding Mandarin as a mandatory language in China? So yeah, I think language policy certainly can play the othering role. And like I said, this is something that I think is under, at least by political scientists, maybe not as much on the linguist side now, is understudied on the Tanzanian policy, which is it's been for a long time, right, seen as this, again, promoting Kiswahili as the cornerstone for national unity in Tanzania. But the flip side of that policy has been, as Mwalimu Nganyoni put there in the chat, has been more certainly discouragement, in some cases kind of active suppression of the use of people's first languages in other areas of public life. And so I think there is that othering. On the other hand, in Kenya, you also have a situation where politicians can feel free to campaign in their first language, when in fact there are, despite stereotypes, almost no truly ethnically homogenous areas of Kenya, especially on the county level, right? Even the counties that are most associated with one group or another have populations of people who speak other languages. And so even a policy, for example, that would switch give the county assemblies the right to use the locally predominant first language in the county assembly, as some politicians, particularly early after the 2013 constitution, some politicians from ODM supported this. This would still be an othering policy to those who are not in the majority group in those counties. And then just in briefly here about the idea of soft power and Mandarin is a mandatory language in Africa. I mean, I just think the resources for that would be massive, and I think it would be very hard to implement. But I do think the Chinese have continued to support the Chinese language. I know both Kenya and Tanzania have really some outstanding and recently built Confucius institutes, and some of my former students, or at least several of my former students from when I taught at Majengo Secondary School in Moshi, Tanzania, have gone on to study or work or visit China. And so, I mean, I think the Chinese language is definitely on the move in sub-Saharan Africa, but I think it's more going to be about the appeal of soft power and exchange type opportunities, as opposed to a push for Mandarin at least as a mandatory language everyone must take. As a language that maybe some schools or universities will be mandated to offer, that might be a way in which we see support for Mandarin get promoted.
Well, we're almost out of time, just 1 minute left. So I think we can stop here. And again, thank you so much. This was a very informative, interesting talk. So we appreciate you coming and sharing with us. And thank you to the audience for coming and asking questions. and making comments. We appreciate that. So thank you, everybody, and we'll see you in 2 weeks. Thank you, Dr. Marshall.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Saar, and thanks for having me. And as I said, please, anyone, do feel free to follow up by email. I appreciate your thoughts and comments on my work.